Hello. This story comes from North America and it's all about Coyote, who's just a little bit of a trickster. So long, long ago, when the world was young and all the colours were fresher and brighter and the shapes of the world were just that little bit more sharper and clean cut, some of the animals looked very different to the way they do today. For instance, Wildcat had a long pointed nose and a long tail that she just loved to lash about like a furry snake whenever she got angry. And Coyote, well, he had a little smushed up face like a pug dog and his tail was just a tiny little stump. And one day, he was walking through the forest. It was a beautiful day. The birds were singing, the sun was shining, and Coyote was in the mood to create a little bit of mischief. And he found Wildcat curled up, fast asleep on a log. And he went round the back, and there was her tail hanging down, and the end was just twitching away as she was dreaming about catching mice. And he thought, yes, we can have some fun here. And he went up to her tail and he took hold of the end of her tail and he twisted and he twisted and twisted, and every time he twisted her tail it got shorter and shorter and shorter until it was only half as long as it used to be. And then he went round to the front and he put his paw on the end of her long pointed nose and he pushed and he pushed and he pushed, and her nose got shorter and shorter and shorter until eventually she had a little flat face that cats have nowadays. And when he'd finished, he dusted his hands off and he went off feeling really pleased with himself. Well, a little bit later, Wildcat woke up and, she had that horrible taste you get in your mouth when you've fallen asleep during the day, and she thought, I need a drink. And she went down to her favourite pool and she bent over, and as she went to lap up the water, she caught sight of her reflection and she said, what? Who's done this to my face? Who's been messing around with me? And she got really angry and she started to lash her tail, and that didn't feel quite right. And when she looked back over her shoulder, half her tail was gone. And she thought, I bet that Coyote had something to do with this. And so she went back to where she'd been asleep. And yes, there in the dirt around the log were lots of footprints, and they were all Coyote's. So she tracked him. She stalked him through the forest and found him lying fast asleep with his chin on his paws. And she thought, right, I'm going to get my own back on you. And zing! Out came her claws, and she went round to Coyote's bottom and she hooked her claws into the end of his tail, and she pulled and she pulled and she pulled, and his tail got longer and longer and longer, and in the end she shredded the ends to make it fluffy just for a bit of extra detail. And then she went round to his little flat face and she hooked her claws into the end of his nose, and she pulled and she pulled and she pulled, and his nose got longer and longer and longer until he had a face like all dogs have nowadays. And then she dusted her paws off and off she went. And Coyote woke up and he yawned and oh, there was a nose out there. Coyote could see a nose out in front of him. He'd never seen a nose out there before, and he started to wonder, whose nose could that be? So very, very carefully and gingerly he took his paw and he put it on top of this nose, and that felt odd, because his paw could feel a nose underneath it, and his nose could feel a paw on top of it, which meant it was his nose out there, where his nose had never been before. And he thought, no, why's my nose out there? And he was just about to open his mouth and give a little whine, and he thought, my mouth doesn't feel right. And he felt, and his jaw had got longer, and he thought, oh no. And then he had a thought. Hang on a minute. If my jaw's got longer, then my mouth has got bigger, and if my mouth has got bigger, that means when I eat I can get more food in my mouth. Whoa-hey! And he was so excited that he started to wag his tail, and that felt very odd indeed, because in the past there'd just been this little stub flicking about from side to side. Now there was something big and swishy going on behind him, and when he looked over his shoulder, it was like having a big furry flag waving about. And this was so fantastic that he put back his head and he opened his mouth and he howled. And the sound that came out was so much bigger and louder than anything that he'd ever made before, that he was really, really happy. And Coyote and all his descendants are still so happy about what happened to him that day that if you go out into the wild lands of America, you can hear them howling with pleasure. And as for Wildcat and her descendants, well, they've never forgiven Coyote for what he did to Wildcat. And I think that's why cats are still so grumpy today. And that, my friends, is the tale of two tales.